In Vietnam, no one cared what color you were. What mattered was whether you could move quietly and whether you came back. Between 1962 and 1973, nearly 60,000 Australians served in Vietnam. They worked in the heat. They walked long patrols. And when they returned home, they came back to a country that mostly didn't want to talk about the war. Some came back with medals. Some came back with stories their families would hear once, if at all. Others came back with no record that anyone remembers. There were black Australian soldiers in Vietnam, Indigenous men, Torres Strait Islanders, men whose grandfathers had fought in the First World War, whose fathers had fought in the Second. They carried the same rifles, wore the same uniforms, and bled the same blood. But when the war ended, something quietly disappeared. The photographs rarely showed them. Interviews didn't seem to find them. Books didn't name them, not because they weren't there, but because no one thought to look. This isn't a political story. It's not about blame or modern judgment. It's about what happened, what was remembered, and what slowly faded away. By the end, you'll understand how that happened and why it still matters. Australia didn't send black soldiers to Vietnam any differently. There were no separate units, no special rules. If you were the right age and your birthday was drawn, you went. National service applied to everyone, same lottery, same rules. Some enlisted by choice, others were conscripted. Some went because their fathers had gone to war before them. Others went because it meant steady pay, regular meals, and a sense of belonging. When Australia committed ground troops in 1965, selection was simple. Medical check. Fitness, that was it. Heritage didn't matter. So young men went from cattle stations in Queensland, from missions in New South Wales, from wheat country in Western Australia, from Darwin, from communities where war stories went back generations. They trained together, Puckapunyal, Canungra, long days in the jungle, polishing boots at night, rifle drills, pack marches, the same instructors shouting at everyone the same way. In the barracks, you were just a name and a number. On parade, shoulders back, eyes front. In the mess, you ate the same food as everyone else. For some men, it was the first time in their lives they were treated exactly the same as everyone around them. No one can point to a moment when it became clear that some stories wouldn't be told the same way. There was no announcement, no decision. It happened quietly. A photograph taken of one section but not another. An interview request sent to one soldier but not the man standing beside him. A letter of commendation was sent home, but no reporter knocked on the family's door. After the war, historians recorded hundreds of interviews. Veterans sat in living rooms and talked about fire support bases, dust, mud, and patrols. But not every living room was visited. Not every voice was recorded. Over time, those recordings became the story. And what wasn't recorded slowly disappeared. So why did this happen? That's the question. Not answered with theories or accusations, but by looking carefully at what actually occurred, step by step. From enlistment to service to the decades afterward. Because in Vietnam, paying attention keeps you alive, and in history, attention keeps you remembered. For some men, wearing the uniform meant more than just service. It meant equality. Indigenous Australians had served in every major conflict since the Boer War. Some weren't even citizens when they enlisted. They couldn't vote. They couldn't always drink in the same pubs or live where they wanted. But they could serve, and many did. By the time Vietnam came, military service was already a family tradition in some communities. A grandfather at Gallipoli, a father in New Guinea, now a son in Southeast Asia. There were men from the Torres Strait Islands whose families had served for generations. Men from remote stations in the Northern Territory. Men from New South Wales towns where indigenous families had lived for thousands of years. They enlisted for different reasons. Some wanted stable work. Some wanted to prove themselves. Some wanted to leave towns where everyone knew their name and their past. Some simply wanted to belong to something bigger. Training erased most differences. At Puckapunyal or Canungra, no one cared who your father was. They cared whether you could march 20 miles with a full pack, whether you could clean your rifle in the dark, whether your boots were polished and your locker squared away. The instructors didn't go easy on anyone. If anything, they pushed harder. That was the point. Break everyone down, build them back up the same way. At night in the barracks, men talked about home, about girls, about what they'd do after service. The same conversations young men have when they're far from home and unsure what's coming. Some formed close friendships, the kind that later meant survival. Others kept quiet, did their job, kept their heads down. Both ended up in Vietnam. National service mixed everyone together. University students and farm workers, city boys and bush kids, volunteers and conscripts. Some wanted to be there, some didn't. But once you were in, you were in. Training was realistic. Jungle warfare school meant weeks in the scrub. Learning to move without sound. Learning to read the ground. Learning that noise could get you killed. They trained with the weapons they'd carry, the L1A1 SLR, the M60, the M79. They learned formations, contact drills, and what to do when shooting started. And above all, they learned to trust the man next to them. Because in the jungle, that trust was everything. Not everyone who trained went to Vietnam. Some served elsewhere. Some finished their time and went home. But for those whose names were called, there was a moment when it became real. Orders, packing, leave before deployment, going home to say goodbye. For some families, it was familiar. Parents who had done the same thing a generation earlier. They knew what to say and what not to say. For some families, the goodbye was familiar. They'd done it before. Parents who had lived through earlier wars knew how these moments worked. They knew what to say and what not to say. For others, it was frightening and new. Mothers held on a little too long. Fathers shook hands and stayed quiet. Brothers and sisters didn't really understand where you were going, only that you were leaving. Then came the flight. Long hours in the air. A stop in Darwin. Then the Philippines or Singapore, finally Saigon or Vung Tau. Men slept when they could, some played cards. Others stared out the window at endless water. A few joked. Most didn't. Nearly everyone was nervous. Some were scared and doing their best to hide it. When you stepped off the plane, the heat hit hard. It felt solid, like walking into a wall. The air smelled of fuel, smoke, and rotting plants. Helicopters thumped overhead. Trucks roared past. People shouted in languages you didn't understand. This was Vietnam, and it felt nothing like training. Australian units were based at Nui Dat in Phuoc Thai province. The base was carved out of jungle and rubber trees. At first, there were tents. Later came wooden hooches. In the dry season, everything was dust. In the wet, everything was mud. You were posted to a battalion, 1 RAR, 2 RAR, 3 RAR, all the way through 9 RAR. Battalions rotated. Inside each battalion were companies. Inside companies were platoons. Inside platoons were sections. And your section became your whole world. 8 or 10 men. A corporal in charge, a couple of experienced soldiers, a few new ones. These were the men you walked with, ate with, slept near, and depended on. If you were a black soldier, this was where you learned what kind of men they were. Most of the time, it didn't matter. You did your job. You pulled your weight. You were accepted. That was it. The Australian Army in Vietnam was disciplined and professional. There was little patience for the racial tension seen in some other forces. Australian soldiers had a reputation. They moved quietly. They planned carefully. They avoided unnecessary risks. And they looked after their own. If you could keep up on patrol, stay alert, and do your share, you were one of the group. For many black soldiers, this was what the uniform promised. Out in the jungle, nothing mattered except whether you could do the job. Still, there were small moments. A careless comment made when tempers were short. A joke that didn't land right. A glance during a mail call when your letter showed you came from a mission or reserve. Most of it wasn't meant to hurt, but it was there. You learned to deal with it the same way you dealt with everything else. Quietly, carefully, always paying attention. The first patrols were overwhelming. The jungle closed in on you. The heat crushed you. Your pack dug into your shoulders and your rifle felt heavier with every step. You learned to walk differently, heel to toe, watching the ground, listening for every sound. The men ahead of you moved smoothly, almost silently. At first you didn't. Nobody did. A snapped branch, a rattling canteen, a boot scraping stone. The corporal would halt the patrol and stare until you understood your mistake. Then you moved on. After a few weeks, you stopped making noise. Your body learned the rhythm. Your ears learned which sounds mattered. Your eyes learned to catch movement in the sea of green. You began to understand what the older diggers already knew: silence kept you alive. There were different kinds of patrols. Some were routine, walking tracks, passing through villages, showing presence. Others were ambushes. You'd set up at night along a trail and wait, sometimes for hours, sometimes until dawn, often for nothing at all. The hardest were search and destroy missions, looking for enemy camps or supply caches. These took you deep into the jungle where the enemy knew the ground better than you ever could. You learned to read signs: bent grass, footprints, disturbed soil, the smell of smoke or tobacco. You learned to trust your instincts. If something felt wrong, it usually was. Australians fought differently from the Americans. American units moved in larger numbers with heavy firepower and quick air support. Australians worked in small patrols, slow and quiet. The goal was to find the enemy before they found you. It took discipline. No smoking, no talking, hand signals only, every man watching his arc. The Viet Cong learned to respect Australian infantry. They knew Australians were hard to ambush. They knew they could track. They knew Australian patrols were dangerous. That reputation was earned by every soldier who walked those tracks, including black diggers who moved just as carefully and quietly as anyone else. Back at base, life followed a routine. You came in from patrol filthy and worn out. Dropped your gear, cleaned your weapon, ate, slept. Then did it all again. Some days nothing happened, patrols with no contact at all. Other days violence came fast and disappeared just as quickly. You wrote letters home. You tried to explain, but the words never felt right. So you mostly said you were fine and asked about home. At night, friendships formed quickly. Sitting around smoking, talking about nothing. Bonds built fast when tomorrow was uncertain. You learned who you could rely on. Almost everyone had a moment when Vietnam stopped feeling like an adventure. For some, it was the first firefight. For others, it was seeing someone wounded or killed. Sometimes it was just the slow buildup of heat, fear, and exhaustion until it became clear this wasn't ending anytime soon. That moment changed you. Some became quieter and more careful. Others became angry and reckless. Either way, you weren't the same person who stepped off the plane. Black soldiers went through all of this just like everyone else. The fear, the boredom, the exhaustion, the sudden terror. They earned the same respect and carried the same weight. But there was an extra thought in the back of their minds. Out here, the uniform made you equal. Back home, it wouldn't. After a few months, you weren't new anymore. You knew the routine. You knew the sounds. You knew which places were dangerous and which were just draining. You'd been shot at. Maybe you'd fired back. You'd seen things you'd never talk about. And you learned the biggest lesson of Vietnam: survival was as much luck as skill. The Viet Cong didn't fight the way regular armies were expected to. They didn't hold ground or wear clear uniforms. They didn't line up for battles you could see coming. They struck quickly and vanished. A burst of AK fire from the tree line, an RPG fired from a hidden tunnel, a mine placed on a path you'd walked the day before. Then silence. By the time you found cover and fired back, they were gone. Afterward, you might find a blood trail, a few shell casings, a footprint, maybe a sandal mark. But no bodies, no prisoners, nothing you could point to and call a win. Australian tactics were built around small patrols. 4 to 10 men moving slowly and quietly through the jungle, watching for signs the enemy had been there. The lead scout mattered more than anyone. He set the pace. He read the ground. He spotted the tripwire before someone stepped on it. A good scout kept everyone alive. Some of the best scouts were black soldiers, men who'd grown up in the bush, men who knew how to move without being heard, who could read tracks the way their grandfathers had taught them. In the Australian Army, that kind of skill counted. A corporal who could track and sense danger was more valuable than someone with good schooling or connections back home. Out here, confidence and ability were what mattered. There were moments of respect that stayed with you. A section commander asking what you thought about a trail. Another digger gives you an easier watch because you'd been on point all day. An officer mentioning your name during a debrief. They weren't big gestures, just quiet signs that people noticed you were doing your job well. For men who grew up being overlooked, those moments meant a lot. The army had its flaws, but in the jungle, skill was hard to ignore. Night patrols were different. The jungle never went quiet. Animals moved. Insects buzzed. Leaves shifted in the wind. You learned what belonged and what didn't. A sound that stopped too suddenly. A smell that shouldn't be there. A feeling you couldn't explain. You froze. A hand signal went up. Everyone stopped. Sometimes it was nothing. Other times the Viet Cong were close, moving through the same jungle just as quietly as you were. Then it came down to who spotted who first. Ambushes were the hardest. You'd set up along a trail at dusk, claymores in place, fields of fire marked. Then you waited, hours of waiting, mosquitoes, heat, muscles locking up, not moving, barely breathing, listening to footsteps that could be enemy soldiers or just a buffalo passing through. If they came, the claymores went first. A blinding flash, a roar of noise, then automatic fire, shouting, confusion. When it was over, you checked the ground. Sometimes there were bodies. Sometimes there was nothing at all. There was something that happened in many Australian sections that people rarely talked about later. The way the men looked after each other. If someone was struggling with the heat, another carried part of his load. If someone was scared, someone stayed close. If someone was shaken by what they'd seen, someone sat beside them in silence. It wasn't written down anywhere. It wasn't taught. It was just how things worked. For black soldiers, this mattered deeply. For many, it was the first time they'd been part of something where they were judged by what they contributed, not by who they were. Contact could come from anywhere. A sniper shot from the trees, an ambush on a trail, a booby trap nobody spotted in time. When it happened, you didn't think so. Training took over. You hit the ground, returned fire, found the enemy. The section moved as one. Some laid down fire while others moved. Grenades went in. M79 rounds followed. If there was a chance to flank, you took it. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it ended. The enemy broke contact and disappeared. You lay there in the dirt, breathing hard, checking yourself for wounds you hadn't felt yet. Then you checked your mates. Casualties changed everything. The first time you saw someone badly wounded, it stayed with you. The sounds they made, the look in their eyes, the smell of blood and fear. You called for a dust-off, set security, did everything you could until the helicopter arrived. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. Back at base, nobody wanted to talk about it. You cleaned your weapon, wrote a letter home that said nothing important. I tried to sleep. But when you closed your eyes, it came back. Australia took losses in Vietnam. 521 killed, more than 3,000 wounded. Fewer than some other forces, but every one of them mattered. Every death left a gap in a section, a platoon, a family. Some of those losses were black soldiers. They bled the same. They died the same. They were mourned the same, at least while the war was still going. There were good days, too. Days when nothing happened. Days when parcels arrived from home. Days when someone told a joke that made everyone laugh. Days when you remembered you were still alive. You heated tins of food over small burners, shared cigarettes, talk about what you'd do after the war, buy a car, get married, find work, sleep in a proper bed. Normal plans that felt far away but helped you keep going. The monsoon season was brutal. Rain fell so hard you could barely see 10 meters. Everything stayed wet. Uniforms, boots, weapons, skin. You'd rig a poncho shelter and try to sleep while water ran beneath you. Patrols were miserable. Tracks turned into rivers. Mud pulled at your boots. You couldn't hear much over the rain, but you still went out. The Viet Cong were out there too, and the rain helped them. By your second or third month, you understood the rhythm. 2 weeks in the bush, a few days at base, then back out again. The base wasn't completely safe. Rockets and mortars still came in. Sappers tried to sneak through the wire, but it was safer than the jungle. You could shower, eat hot food, sleep without worrying if someone was crawling toward you in the dark. You talked with other units, swapped information, build a picture of the war beyond your own patrols. There was a phrase soldiers used. There it is. Rain for days on end. There it is. Orders to patrol the same ground again. There it is. A mate was wounded. There it is. It wasn't complaining, it was acceptance. A way of dealing with things you couldn't change, so you accepted it, and you carried on. Some soldiers counted everything. Days left in the country, patrols done, contacts survived. Others refused to count at all. They said counting only made time crawl. Either way, everyone had a rough idea of when their tour would end. 12 months in Vietnam, then home. That date mattered. You could get through almost anything if you believed it would eventually end. Vietnam was confusing in ways no training could prepare you for. You couldn't always tell who the enemy was. You couldn't tell if you were winning. You couldn't even tell if what you were doing made a difference. You patrolled. You fought when contact came. You tried to stay alive and trusted that someone, somewhere, understood the reason for it all. There was a difference between being in Vietnam and understanding it. Most soldiers never understood it. You knew your section. You knew your platoon. You knew the ground you walked on. The bigger picture, the politics, the strategy that belonged to officers and politicians. Your job was simple: walk the ground. Phuoc Thai province was a mix of everything. Thick jungle, rubber plantations, rice paddies, villages, hills. Each kind of terrain brought its own danger. In the jungle, you could barely see 10 meters, perfect ambush country. In rubber plantations, the trees stood in neat rows. You could see farther, but so could the enemy. Rice paddies offered no cover at all. One sniper could stop an entire section. Villages were the hardest. You never knew who was VC and who was just trying to get through the day. The hills were exhausting, steep climbs under full load, always watching for bunkers and prepared positions. You learned to hate all of it equally. Australian tactics focused on staying quiet. The Americans relied heavily on airstrikes and artillery. Their presence was obvious. Australians tried to disappear. Small patrols, slow movement, no unnecessary shooting. The idea was to find the enemy first, get into position, and strike before they could react. It took discipline. You didn't fire the moment you saw movement. You waited. When you heard something, you froze instead of panicking. When you walked into an ambush, you didn't run, you pushed through it. The men who mastered that approach survived. There's a patrol many veterans remember. Different units, different times. Same story, moving through the jungle. The lead scout raises his fist. Everyone stops. He's seen something that doesn't belong, a wire, a footprint, a sign out of place. The section moves forward carefully. Half buried in leaves, there's a mine, a booby trap, or the entrance to a bunker hidden with branches. You mark it, move around it, continue the patrol. Back at base, the section commander mentions it during the debrief. Good spotting, probably saved lives. In some of those stories, the lead scout was a black soldier. That detail never made it into official reports. It didn't need to. It was just part of the job. Tracking was a skill few truly mastered. Some men had an eye for it: a crushed leaf, a bent blade of grass, a stone turned over, damp underneath. Signs someone had passed recently. The best trackers could tell you how many men there were, how long ago they'd passed, whether they were carrying heavy loads, and whether they knew they were being followed. That skill came from patience and experience. Some black soldiers had grown up learning it, family members who hunted, elders who taught them to read the land. In Vietnam, that knowledge mattered and it was respected. Villages were scattered across the province. Some supported the VC. Some didn't, Most were caught in between. When you entered a village, you watched everything: who stared at you, who looked away, who moved when you arrived. You spoke to the village chief through an interpreter, asked about VC activity, checked ID cards. The answers were always the same: no VC here, we are peaceful farmers. At night, those same villagers might feed VC units passing through, or they might be terrified of both sides. You never really knew. Rules of engagement were strict. You couldn't fire unless fired upon or unless you clearly identified the enemy. On paper, it made sense. On patrol, it could be deadly. You'd see movement. Was it a VC or a farmer, armed or not? By the time you decided, they were gone or shooting. Australians followed those rules closely. Civilian casualties were lower in Australian areas, but the risk to soldiers was higher. Fire support bases were set up on hills across the province. Artillery units operated 105 and 155 guns. Infantry provided security. Patrols could call for fire if they made contact, pass coordinates, adjust rounds, and bring shells down on enemy positions. When it worked well. But it required clear communication, accurate grids, and trust that rounds wouldn't fall short. Some patrols operated beyond artillery range. Those were the loneliest patrols. If contact came, you handled it yourself. There's a shared memory among several black veterans: being on patrol in a section that trusted you completely. The corporal put you on point because he knew you'd spot danger first. Other diggers positioned themselves based on where you were because they trusted your judgment. No speeches, no talk about race, just trust. And in Vietnam, trust meant everything. That trust wasn't given lightly. It was earned. Patrol after patrol, long days when nothing happened, short moments when everything did. Through exhaustion, fear, and steady competence, until there was no doubt. For men who had spent their lives being underestimated, that trust meant more than any medal. Contact rarely lasted long. Seconds of chaos, gunfire, then silence. The VC melted back into the jungle. You secured the area. Check your mates. I collected anything useful, continued the patrol, or called for extraction. As the adrenaline drained, your hands shook. You realized how hard you were breathing. You noticed the sweat soaking your uniform. And you understood once again that you were still alive. That feeling never really faded. Someone once said war is long stretches of boredom broken by moments of pure terror. That was exactly right. Days of walking where nothing happened. Nights spent in ambush positions where no one came through. Long hours on guard staring into an empty tree line. And then suddenly, contact. For a few seconds or minutes, everything was noise, confusion, and fear. Then it ended and life went back to routine. The Australian Army did recognize good soldiers. Promotions happened. Commendations were given. Names were mentioned in reports. Some black soldiers earned those things. They became corporals or sergeants. They were trusted with responsibility. They trained new men. The system wasn't perfect, but in Vietnam, if you did your job well, there were chances to move up. There's a photo that exists only in memory. A section lined up after an operation. 10 men, filthy and exhausted, weapons slung, standing in front of a captured bunker or supplies. The kind of photo soldiers took to mark getting through something difficult. In the photos that do exist, you can sometimes see black soldiers standing in the back row or off to the side, part of the section, part of the job. But for every photo taken, many more never were. And for every unit recorded in official history, others were quietly left out. Patrols near the Cambodian border were different. The Viet Cong used the border area as a safe zone. They stored supplies there and moved freely, knowing you couldn't cross over. You'd patrol right up to the line and watch. Sometimes you could see movement on the other side, villagers, VC units moving openly. You'd report it. Nothing would happen. Orders were orders. The war had its own language. Contact meant a fight. Dust off meant a medical evacuation. Sitrep was a situation report. Charlie was the VC. Yank meant Americans. Nasho was a national serviceman. You learned radio codes and hand signals, but you also learned what wasn't said. The pause before someone answered. The way a man cleaned his rifle after a fight. The silence in the helicopter after a bad patrol. Those things said more than words. The jungle caused its own damage. Malaria, leeches, skin infections, dysentery, foot rot from wet boots. Even when the enemy wasn't trying to kill you, the environment was. You took your pills, burned leeches off with cigarettes, changed socks when you could, treated water, and accepted that being sick was part of the deal. There it is. Some sections built reputations. This corporal runs a tight patrol. That section has the best scout. These guys are aggressive. Those guys are cautious. Reputation mattered. Other units took notice. Officers remembered names. Inside sections, individuals earned reputations too. Solid in contact, reliable on guard, good navigator at night. Black soldiers earned those reputations the same way as anyone else, by doing the job well, again and again. There were moments that cut through the war in unexpected ways. Sharing water with a wounded VC while waiting for evacuation or capture. Stepping carefully around a family's cooking pot left on a trail. Treating a village child with your own medical supplies. The enemy was still the enemy, but sometimes the reality of people broke through the training. By 6 months in the country, you weren't new anymore. You knew the routines. You knew the risks. You knew the odds. And all that mattered was getting through the next 6 months. You stopped thinking about why you were there. You focused on the next patrol, the next week, the next mail delivery, small steps. That's how you survived. Going home felt strange. Mentally, you were still in Vietnam, jumping at sounds, watching hands in doorways. Physically, you were on a plane full of soldiers heading back. Some slept. Some stared out the window. Some talked too loudly about things that didn't matter. When you landed, nothing felt right. By then, the war was unpopular. Protests were common. People shouted. Some spat at uniforms. You were told not to wear yours in public. Keep your head down, don't talk about it, so you didn't. Home had changed, or you had, probably both. For black soldiers, coming home was especially hard. In Vietnam, the uniform made you equal. Back in Australia, the uniform came off. And suddenly, you were back to being seen the way you always had been, with all the limits and assumptions that came with it. There was no real transition, no proper debrief, no counseling. You were discharged and sent home. Figure it out yourself. Some went back to the same communities they'd left, missions, country towns, remote stations. They tried to slip back into old lives, but it didn't fit. The places were the same. The people were the same. They weren't. Nobody wanted to hear about Vietnam. If you brought it up, people changed the subject. It was uncomfortable. Politics. Too close to things they'd seen on television and wanted to forget. So eventually, you stopped talking. Some men couldn't settle at all. They drifted from job to job, town to town. Civilian life felt empty. No mission. No mates watching your back. Just work, bills, and people who couldn't understand what you'd been through. RSL clubs were meant to be places for veterans. Sometimes they were. Sometimes they weren't. For black veterans, some clubs meant comments, looks, or quiet exclusion. Not everywhere, but often enough that you learned where you were welcome and where you weren't. The government did offer support, medical care, pensions, employment programs, but you had to know how to access them. Forms, paperwork, systems that were hard to navigate, especially for men from remote communities or with limited schooling. Many missed out simply because they didn't know how to ask. Post-traumatic stress didn't have a name yet. You were just called troubled, difficult, someone who couldn't cope. You drank to sleep. You jumped at loud noises. You avoided crowds. People thought you were lazy or making excuses. There were no support groups, no real therapy. You handled it yourself or you didn't. Some veterans managed to build good lives, jobs, families, stability. They locked Vietnam away and carried on. From the outside, they looked fine. Others struggled. Alcohol, broken relationships, unemployment, homelessness, wounds no one could see. For black veterans, support was even thinner. Fewer connections, fewer resources, more judgment. Families tried to help. Parents who had fought in earlier wars recognized the signs. But Vietnam was different. It wasn't a clear victory. It wasn't something people were proud of. Even those who cared didn't know what to say. There's a pattern in the stories of Black Vietnam veterans. They came home. They stayed quiet. They got on with life as best they could. Their service became something private, not because they weren't proud of it, but because no one seemed interested. In the 1980s and 1990s, historians began sitting down with Vietnam veterans. They recorded interviews, made documentaries, and wrote books. The goal was simple: capture the stories before the men got too old or passed away. It was important work, and it needed to be done. But many Black veterans were missed. There were a few reasons for that. One was geography. A lot of Black veterans lived in remote or regional areas. Historians tended to work out of cities, using existing networks. They contacted people through RSL clubs and veteran organizations. If you weren't part of those circles, you were easy to miss. Records were another problem. Some service files were incomplete. Some names weren't listed clearly in databases. If your paperwork didn't line up, you didn't show up on anyone's list. And then there was assumption. Nobody really stopped to ask whether Black veterans might have had different experiences. Nobody thought to look for them specifically, so they weren't looked for at all. The archive grew anyway: hundreds of interviews, thousands of documents, photos, maps, after-action reports. A detailed record of Australia's war in Vietnam, but with gaps. Gaps most people didn't notice, because when you don't know something is missing, you don't think to question it. The veterans who were left out didn't complain. That wasn't how they'd been raised. Complaining didn't usually get you anywhere. You just carried on. So they did. Some told their stories at home. Their children and grandchildren heard pieces, stories about a patrol, a strange moment, something funny. Sometimes, late at night, something darker would come out. Those stories were never recorded. They stayed around kitchen tables and in living rooms. Private history. By the 2000s, Vietnam veterans were getting older. Some had already died. Many were dealing with long-term health problems linked to their service: Agent Orange, old wounds, illnesses that never quite went away. The war kept taking, long after it ended. The government started to offer more formal recognition: welcome home marches, memorials, apologies for how veterans had been treated when they returned. It mattered, even if it came late. But for Black veterans, something was still missing. The official story of Australia's Vietnam War didn't really include them. They were there, but you wouldn't know it. History gets written by those who write things down. That sounds obvious, but it matters. If nobody records your story, no photos, no interviews, then decades later it's as if you were never there. The erasing of Black Australian soldiers from Vietnam history wasn't planned. No one sat down and decided to exclude them. It happened through small choices. A photo taken of one group, not another. An interview request sent to one address, not another. A database that didn't capture certain details. Each choice seemed minor. Together, they created an absence. Black soldiers did serve in Vietnam. The proof exists in service records, in family memories, in the recollections of other soldiers who stood beside them. But that evidence is scattered. It isn't gathered in one place. It isn't part of the main story most Australians are taught. Some researchers have tried to change that. Indigenous history projects, academic studies, community interviews. They've saved stories that would have disappeared otherwise, but the work is hard. Many veterans are gone. Others don't want to talk. Records are incomplete. Funding is limited, especially for projects outside the mainstream. The Australian War Memorial tells the story of Australia at war. It does a lot well. But if you walk through the Vietnam section, you could easily miss the fact that Black Australians served there. They aren't highlighted. They aren't centered. They're not exactly missing, but they're not visible. That matters. History shapes how people see themselves. Young Indigenous Australians visiting that memorial should be able to see themselves in the story. They should know their people served, fought, and contributed, not as a footnote, but as part of the main picture. There are efforts now to fix this. Research projects, ceremonies, media stories, progress is slow, and that raises questions. Why did it take this long? What else have we overlooked? Veterans feel differently about the attention. Some welcome it. They're glad their service is finally being acknowledged. Others are wary. After decades of being ignored, the sudden interest feels strange. And some don't care at all. They did their job. That was enough. All of those reactions make sense. There's a harder question underneath it all. What does it mean to serve a country that doesn't fully see you? To fight for a nation that treats you as unequal at home? The men who went to Vietnam didn't have neat answers. They went anyway. Patriotism is complicated for Indigenous Australians. Their history stretches back tens of thousands of years. Then came colonization, loss, violence, stolen generations. And still, when the country called, many answered. Not because everything was right, but because service meant something. Belonging, proving yourself, standing shoulder to shoulder with others, wearing the uniform even if only for a while. Some people talk about warrior traditions. For some men that mattered. For others it was simpler. It was a job, a way out, a chance. Not everything needs a deeper explanation. The Vietnam War ended in 1975. 50 years have passed. New generations know the war through movies and books. And in those stories, Black Australian soldiers are mostly absent. That absence shapes what people think they know. One Indigenous Vietnam veteran put it simply: "We didn't ask to be remembered separately. We just asked to be remembered." Families still carry these stories. Sons and daughters who heard fragments. Grandchildren who found medals in a drawer. Relatives who learned years later that someone they loved had been to war. These stories matter. They are history. Some of them are being recovered now. Veterans speaking late in life. Families sharing what they have. Researchers working with communities. It's not too late, but time is running out. Every year more stories disappear. This didn't happen for just one reason. Racism played a role. So did distance, bureaucracy, lack of resources, and assumptions about whose stories mattered. Those assumptions shaped the record we have today. This isn't unique to Australia. Similar gaps exist in the United States, Canada, New Zealand, anywhere minority soldiers served. It's a pattern, and patterns tell us how history gets made. The men who served don't need permission to be proud. They were there. They know what they did. Medals and recognition matter, but lived experience matters more. For the rest of us, the missing history matters too, because history tells us who we are. And when parts of it are missing, the picture is incomplete. Some say focusing on race divides people, that all veterans should be remembered the same. But they aren't being remembered the same. Fixing that isn't division, it's honesty. The story of Black Australian soldiers in Vietnam is part of a larger truth: service given despite inequality, contribution without full acceptance. It's uncomfortable, but it's real. There are monuments now, memorials in some communities. That's a start. But memory isn't just stone. It's stories told, lessons taught, and names remembered. Indigenous Australians still serve today in high numbers. They deserve to know the full story of those who came before them, including the Vietnam veterans whose names aren't widely known. There is a photograph, an Australian infantry section in Vietnam. 10 men, dirty, tired, standing together. In the back row, a black soldier, clear face, rifle slung. He looks like everyone else, because he was. That photograph is sitting in a family album somewhere, not in a museum, not in a history book, just kept at home, passed down quietly. That's where most of these stories have lived for years. The work of finding them is still happening. Old archives are being checked. Veterans are being tracked down. Stories are finally being recorded. It can't make up for the years that were lost, but it can shape what comes next. Some veterans have been recognized after they passed away. Their families receive medals or citations their fathers never saw in their lifetime. It matters, but it's bittersweet. You wish it had happened while they were still here to know it counted. The Vietnam War was controversial then, and it still is. People argue about whether Australia should have been there at all, whether the cost was worth it, whether anything was achieved. Those arguments won't stop. But separate from all of that is a simple truth. Men served. Many of them were black, and they deserve to be remembered not as symbols or talking points, but as soldiers who did their job. There isn't a clean ending to this story. The work isn't finished. Recognition is still incomplete. The record still has holes, but awareness is growing. More stories are being told. Slowly, the official history is starting to look more like reality. The veterans who are still alive are now in their 70s and 80s. Time is running out. If you know a Vietnam veteran, ask them about their service. If they're willing to talk, listen. Those stories matter. Once they're gone for good. History isn't just about what happened long ago. It shapes who we are now and who we become. If we ignore parts of our past, we never really understand ourselves. Black Australian soldiers fought in Vietnam. They were there. They served. They don't need to be heroes. They don't need to be symbols. They just need to be seen. They were Australian soldiers.